So a little bit about myself. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a first generation student to the max. I'm first in my family to graduate high school, graduate college, get my master's degree. Basically the first person in my family to do all of those things. I'm the oldest of 4 kids. My parents are Mexican, so I'm Mexican American, and that was a big pressure for me to, fulfill all these things. And so I really, a lot of my research was based off my experience of being Mexican American, first generation, and a woman of color as well. I currently teach middle school social studies. I teach in Vallejo, Solano County, and I'm having the best time with my students. I love teaching the 8th graders. I taught 6th and 7th grade last year, and the 6th grade was very hard. I don't think I will ever do it again, but I really enjoyed the 7th and 8th graders, so I'm going to keep with that. I do eventually want to teach high school because that's where my heart is. And like we said before, I graduated from Dominican with my master's thesis and my teaching credential, so that's a little bit about me, and my cute little baby picture there, just because. So here's our agenda for today. So we're going to go a little bit of review. And then we're going to talk about my research, and then we're going to do an activity that's called Privilege for Sale. We kind of tweaked it from a different source. We're going to talk about white guilt, and then we're going to end the workshop with creating SMART goals. And SMART goals is something that I use at my school. It's to help our students create, reachable, attainable goals so that they can actually succeed in the things that they want to achieve. So setting out a really good plan. And our goal with those SMART goals in the future is to create a workshop to create a plan of action. After taking Katie Lewis's class, I really liked the idea of creating a plan of action for whatever goals you set up for yourself, and we did that with my master's degree, and this is how I ended up here. So it ended up working out, so it's pretty cool. So that's our agenda. So I want to start off with this quote, but race is not the child of racism. But race is a child of racism, not the father. And the reason I want to start off with this quote because of my history background. When we learned about slavery and we learned about the United States, a lot of times people think that racism was just there. It just popped up and people were automatically born racist, and that's kind of how it was, and that's not the truth. We learned, especially my 8th graders learned, that racism was created to justify treating people of color, different origins, the way that they were treated. Slavery, Mexican Americans, immigration, deportation. Racism was created to justify doing all of those acts to these groups of people. And so this quote really kind of just always resonates with me, and I really think it's important to understand that racism was created to justify these things happening. It was not just, created out of nowhere, but it was something that we as a society let happen. So racism defined. Racism has gone through so many changes, and our history has really changed it to show how it has evolved. And if you work through the modules, you know that racism has switched from an overt to kind of a discrete form of racism, which is called new racism. So it's defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership or a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. But like I said, it's shifted. And not only that, it's different across countries. Racism in South Africa, racism in Europe, it's very much different, and especially in other countries. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint what specifically is racism because it varies from country to country, groups, ethnic groups. It's a huge spectrum. But we're specifically talking about the United States, and we see that in our own history from the Jim Crow era with the blatant racism of not allowing Black people into shops, the segregation, Black and white drinking fountains, not letting Mexicans into schools and having separate schools, or even, overtly making Native Americans assimilate into the culture of the United States. That's our overt racism that we know and we acknowledge at times. Sometimes schools don't do that, but that's a discussion for another day. And it switched to something more subtle, to something that's more in our policies, in our system, and it's kind of hard to prove that it's racist. I can kind of touch a little bit on my research, but as a credential student, I was one of the few students of color in the credential program. And to me, that's kind of seemed normal my entire life because most of the schools that I went to, part of my privilege was that I went to very affluent schools, and I was always one of the few students of color in those systems. And so it wasn't very much of a shock to me, but it kind of made me think about what systems were in place that prevented people of color from actually pursuing these careers in higher education. And as being first generation, my parents were not college graduates. They didn't have salaries that would help me go into college. I was a FAFSA, you know, I applied for FAFSA and got all those grants from them, and that's how I was able to support myself through my undergrad. But not a lot of students can afford to do that. If you're a middle class student, you get very few grants and you get more loans. And do you want to take on that loan money to gain that education? That's, you know, a systemic issue right there. But that's just kind of how our racism has really evolved from something that is blatant to something that is more unseen. And it continuously, I see it all the time in my school, and how testing happens, school policies, dress code policies, hairstyle policies that discriminate based on the type of professional type of clothing that you wear, the hair that you present yourself. Those are all hidden racist tendencies in there. So the cycle of whiteness, this cycle was really, it kind of really showed itself in my research, and a lot of my teachers of color that I interviewed really talked about this cycle. And it has a start point, has an end point, but it really just goes in a circle. And our goal as allies is to break it, to end it and not let it continue. So white supremacy, as we know, is the idea that because someone is white, they are better than others. That's something that we kind of know. It's very, as kind of like racism varies, white supremacy varies as well. We have our overt, KKK members who are white supremacists, and they are very much white is supreme, right? Then we have a more subtle version where people say statements, well, Black people commit the most crime. That's something that is kind of about white supremacy, but not really at the level of the KKK. Then we get into white privilege, because the idea that white is superior, individuals who are white are given advantages that people of color do not receive. And white privilege, as you learned in the workshops, does not mean that because you are white, you have not worked hard for the things that you've earned. It just means that you have some advantages that other people don't have. And privilege varies as well. It can be, having two parents in your household. That's a privilege in itself, because you have two forms of income that may support your education. But white privilege is mainly, you're not judged by the color of your skin. People don't think that because you're walking at the street at night, you're a thug, or other forms like that. And then we have white fragility, and that's when, this is probably the hardest one. Once white supremacy and white privilege starts being questioned, I say we because I do benefit from white privilege from times to times, but it comes into play because individuals feel uncomfortable being confronted by information about racial inequality or injustice. So a lot of the statements where it's like, well, it wasn't me, that was my ancestors. I wasn't actually racist like this. Or, but I'm a person of color too. Why are you saying I have white privilege? Well, if you're white passing, even though you come from a country of color, like Mexico for myself, you can have white privilege and you can benefit from those things that other people may not have. So this cycle is a continuous thing. And we as allies, like I said, we have to break it. We have to make sure that it doesn't continue on. And that's what we're going to talk about later on too. So white privilege, I forgot I had the slide here. So white privilege, again, is not the suggestion that white people have never struggled. It's not the assumption that everything that a white person has accomplished is unearned, but it's a privilege that should be viewed as built-in advantages separate from one's level of income or effort. I've talked about myself and my own privileges, and that comes from colorism and the spectrum of being light-skinned versus dark-skinned, being from a country that's more accepted, being from Spain versus Mexico. Those are all parts of white privilege as well. A European country is more accepted in the United States because they blend in more with the American culture rather than a person from Latin America. And so these privileges are something that is built in and not really connected to our income or our effort. And I really think it'll connect to the white guilt that we'll talk about later. So here we have a chat discussion. We have about any questions, open chat for about 2 minutes per person. If you guys have any questions, any comments, and clarifications, Emily is going to be moderating that. All right, it looks like we're good. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. My research focused on teachers of color, systemic racism and education experiences of teacher of color, and I touched on it a little bit, but it really stemmed from my own personal experience. And when you're a person of color, sometimes the experiences that you go through, you're like, am I the only one? Am I the only person that's going through this? You know, or am I making this all up because nobody else seems to be struggling? And so I really was like, I want to see if I'm crazy and making this up or if it's actually something that's happening. And so that's what my motivation was for it. And what happened to me during my credential, like I said, I was one of the few students of color in my credential program, and the credential program Dominican's amazing, and that's not to say it's not, but as a person of color, it was a very isolating experience because my cohort was doing their student teaching in Marin County, and I was doing my student teaching in Santa Rosa. Two different counties, two different type of students. My population was mainly Latino, African American students, and every time I'd come into class, I would share my experiences with my students, and I would get sympathy. And I was just like, why am I receiving sympathy about these experiences for my students? I don't understand. And I think they saw me sharing out these experiences. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry you have to go through that. When I was sharing out my experiences, because hey, this is the reality of everywhere else but Marin County. Like, this is where all these other low-income class schools are going through. I'm not sharing out to get sympathy from you. I'm sharing it out so that you can be aware of these issues. I had one experience with my mentor teacher she was amazing, but this was a questionable incident. And I had a student who was not showing up to school, and I was like kind of curious. And so he was a very bright, smart student. And so I was contacting his dad, and his dad was like, well, I don't know what to do. He's 18 now, like, you know, he's his own person. And I was like, yeah, I understand that. And so I let my mentor teacher know, and she was just like, oh, he just got a girlfriend, and now he just doesn't care about school anymore. And I was like, oh, okay. And then the vice principal came in, we had the same discussion, and she's like, yeah, he just got a girlfriend, he just doesn't care anymore. And the student was of color, and I was like, okay, but what are we gonna do about it? You know, are we gonna do anything to change this kind of student's behavior? And they're like, no, we're not gonna do anything. And I was like, okay. And I'm a student teacher, so I don't really have much control during the situation because I'm just in somebody else's classroom. But those are kind of the experiences that I went through at the school that I was student teaching at, and a couple other situations as well. And so it was just vastly different than my cohort's experience. And so I researched at a Title I charter school district, which I still currently work at. And it is a very low income school. We have grants for almost everything. Our whole, you know, curriculum is grant based. Our food that they receive is grant based. Everything that we basically do is funded by grants, and because it's a Title I school, it is mainly African American and Asian students. Almost 60% of them, I believe, are on low and free and reduced lunch. So it is a school that is very much in a area that is low income. So I focus on the experiences of teachers of color navigating this field of education, focusing on their career through their undergrad, their credential, and anything after, and seeing if they felt the same barriers and experiences that I did. And these experiences are not only related to teachers of color, they're common experiences for, you know, Black, Indigenous people of color as well. They're not just, oh, if you're a teacher, you're going to experience this. These are all just common things that I feel like people of color experience when they're in any form of new system, whether it's a new job, whether it's a company, whether it's you know, a school, you're a student, or you're part of that institution. These are things that they experience regardless. And so it was very relieving to me at the same time, but also frustrating to me that these are the experiences that we all go through, and nothing really has changed about it. So that's a little bit of the background of my research and what motivated me to do that. We're going to go through some of my findings and the naming processes that I came up with while going through this, and yeah. So one of the first things that came up was this idea of entitled uncomfortability. And so the idea that people feel entitled to the way that to feel a certain way when they are called out or on inappropriate or harmful actions toward people of color, they are suddenly the ones that are uncomfortable. And in my research, there was two different experiences, but the first one I'm going to talk about because I think it's a little bit more relevant. They were in my interviewee was in a meeting, and they were talking about, strategies and different types of things to help the students be successful. And my interviewee, who was a Black woman, was talking to her colleague, and her colleague was like, "Oh, no, I'm talking right now." And my colleague took a step back, and she's like, "Okay, I'm a Black woman in a situation with two other white people. I have to remain calm because I don't want to be the angry Black woman." So she remained calmed and later talked to him, and she was like, "I didn't like the way that you addressed me. In the future, can you please not address me like that?" And he was just like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I just, I don't like the way that you were talking to me. So I talked to you that way back." And she's like, "I did not say anything to you. We were talking about student strategies." And he was just like, "Well, I was not comfortable with you talking to me, and this needs to not happen again." So he switched it out on her. And that's kind of the idea of entitled uncomfortability. When people are calling you out on the way that you're acting towards people of color, they suddenly become the ones that are offended. They're suddenly the ones that their feelings are hurt. And so this happens a lot, especially with these kinds of topics, because they're not very comfortable topics to have. And so our first defense is to be defensive of ourselves, to defend ourselves and be like, "Hey, I'm not trying to be racist, or I'm not trying to be, sexist. I'm just saying certain things." And so we automatically defend ourselves, even though we're making somebody else uncomfortable. And it's something that a lot of people of color go through because they do call out certain situations. And when they call them out, it's the other person whose feelings are suddenly brought up forth. So unsupported learning. So this one's kind of like, I've already given an example, but people use their assumptions of individuals based on their successes or failures. So assuming that, one of the workshops talks about the model minority of Asians, where they assume that all Asians will be great at math or great at anything science and technology based because of that model minority myth. Or the opposite, where anybody who speaks Spanish is not going to learn English because they assume that most people who come from other countries are not going to be able to learn English. So they use these assumptions about individuals based on the group's successes or failures, not the individual persons. And so this is something that we see often in our students. With my career, I see all the time where people make assumptions about African American students, Asian students, Latinx students. But this is something that also happens in workforces, where, again, the trope of the angry Black woman, because a Black woman is defending themselves, people assume that all Black women are going to be loud or they're all going to be aggressive. I have a coworker who breaks my heart every time, because every time she speaks, she always has to say, "I don't want to come off aggressive," or "I don't want to come off as short or rude. I'm just saying something," because she's had it so many times that people interpret the way that she says things a certain way. And so she has to preface anything that she says because she feels that people are going to misinterpret what she's saying. And even in her emails, and I'm like, "Oh no, I don't want you to feel like you have to, appease everybody, because people are going to interpret what you say regardless." But it's very heartbreaking to see that happening to her. But people use their assumptions of individuals like that. And then exhaustion. This is the one that I feel like all of you who are of color resonate with this, where you have to constantly prove that you have the knowledge to be in this conversation. I tell Emily all the time, I'm like, "I don't feel like an expert." I don't feel like I really know much, but I'm always learning. But and that comes from, I always had to prove that I knew things. And so once I proved that with my thesis, I'm like, what else do I have to do? It's a big battle. And so, especially in these environments where you are constantly, put down, or you are, the one that's kind of put the blame on, you become disillusioned with the idea that people are actually going to take you seriously. And that in itself is very exhausting to deal with. Last year, we were working on Black History Month as a school, and I have a degree. I have my credential in history, and so I have my degree in sociology. So I know a couple things about Black history, and I really focus on ethnic studies in general in my classes. And so the people who were in charge of the leadership slides, which were supposed to be shared out to the school, asked for my input, and I was looking through it, and I was just like, oh, well, I think we should add more activities, or, if we're going to talk about, the women's voting rights during this time, we should acknowledge that Black women weren't really allowed to vote until 1964 because of the Civil Rights Act. And so I was just adding all of these details where they were kind of missing out, and none of them got implemented. And I was just like, okay, let me ask why. And I asked why. They're like, oh, well, we already had these created and we didn't want to change them. And I was like, oh, okay. So what I did is I created my own, because I'm not about to teach my students a whitewashed history of Black History Month. But that in itself exhausted me, because I was like, I had to create a whole new version of slides and activities for students so that at least in my class and my coworkers' class who wanted to use my slides would have those options, And so I had to prove in a way that I knew what I was talking about and that my students would resonate with the information that I was giving them rather than, this other more static information. And they enjoyed it. I even added a whole week of music because, as we all know, Black music has always been the background for any type of music that's in our history right now. So that's where we gain our rhythm and our, music styles from. So for this activity, it's called Privilege for Sale. We tweaked it a little bit because it was more geared towards gender, but I tweaked it to be overall privileges. And so what we're going to do is we're going to combine you guys in groups about 10 people. And there's a list of privileges, and I own these privileges. You're going to have a certain amount of money to buy them back. And as a group, you have to decide what privileges you want to keep as a group and what privileges you're okay with not having. And so that's kind of how the activity grows. And you have to agree to keep all privileges, right? So it's going to be a very kind of interesting conversation with your group, because some people might want to keep one privilege because they see it as important. Others might want to keep another one. There's 3 roles that we're asking you to decide on your group. The first role is a treasurer. So this person will be in charge of handling the money. So if you bought a privilege, you're just going to subtract the total. That's all you're doing, kind of like a little accountant. The second one's a moderator. So they're the person that will read the privileges. So going through each privileges, together, and you can say I like this one. I feel like all of us really like this one. We'll keep it here and decide if we're going to buy it or not. And then this third person is the transcriber. And this person will document your answers on a different slide that Emily will share. Each slide will have your group name or group number and the amount that you were offered. We also have the instructions linked in the group title. So you just click on the group title and it'll send you to the instructions with all the privileges listed. We're going to have about 10 minutes to decide as a group what privileges you would like to buy back. We may add a little bit more time because it looks like we are pretty good on time right now. So maybe 15 minutes for the group for you guys to decide what you want to do. So that is our activity. We're going to come back as a big group to debrief after. And yeah, so hopefully you'll be very open, having fun, and it's going to be a hard discussion. So don't be afraid of having these conversations. It's going to be interesting once you come back and we participate. All right, Emily. So Emily put in the breakout rooms. They're all going. Exercise was to kind of give you a sense of how exhausting it can be to be a person of color, right? To decide which kind of identities you're gonna, show up a little bit more than the other ones. Sometimes you have the option to choose, sometimes you don't. But it really shows you kind of how exhausting it can be to be a person of color in society today, because there's so many different things that we don't really think about. Personally, for me as a woman and being Latina, there's obviously experiences that I don't understand that my brother goes through, who is Mexican, but he's a man, right? So I have different experiences, and I don't really know that from his point of view unless he tells me, or unless I experience something similar to him. And so that's kind of how I wanted this activity to connect to that exhaustion that people of color have to go through. Because if you really knew all the things that you had to pick and choose all the time, it would make your day very tiresome. As a teacher, we do quick second changes in our lesson plans, and we always kind of just switch things in the middle. And that in itself is a tiring process. And so it also shows how our intersectional identities connect, and how sometimes we prioritize one more identity than another one because we feel like that's the one that we need to protect more, or we feel like that's the one that people are going to see first. And so these intersectional identities really showed up in this activity because you guys mentioned race should be added on there, right? But it wasn't. And that's because we have so many different identities, and some people don't have the, don't have to pick between their race and their gender because they're just a white person. But a Black person will have to pick between their race and gender sometimes, like knowing what their identity stands for. If I am a woman, I'm obviously not going to go walking around at night in the neighborhood because I know that's not safe for me. But if I was a man, I would do it all the time. I would enjoy that fresh air, but as a woman, I can't do that. And so that's where our intersectional identities kind of play into this activity. And so leading into that exhaustion, people of color tend to react in two different ways when this happens. There's intentional silencing and intentional censoring. So as a person of color, I can tell you guys how many times I have brought my own experiences, and I told you guys I have received sympathy for my own experiences, and sometimes I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm just saying, hey, this is my experience. Most other people experience the same thing. Let's listen to this and see what we can do to change it. And I get met with, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you, or there's nothing we can do about it. And because of those reactions, most people of color tend to intentionally silence themselves. So especially when white people feel uncomfortable. Once white people start feeling uncomfortable and they start making it about them instead of the situation, we silence ourselves. We are like, well, there's no point because everybody's going to be concerned about their hurt feelings rather than the action that was implemented on me. And so we just choose to kind of be quiet because we feel like there's no point to continue having the conversation when it's been deterred to something else. Then there's intentional censoring, and this is kind of like code switching in a way, where we have to either withhold info or hide our genuine feelings to avoid further questioning. And so this would kind of happen when you are, the way that I'm talking to you right now, right? I will be talking to you in a professional manner, very academic, very, strict box level kind of thing. But if I was with my friends and I was talking to them about my research, I would be telling them in a different way, a little bit more relaxed, not afraid of making mistakes. And so we intentionally censor ourselves to kind of fit the mold that we're trying to be in so that we can not really hurt people's feelings in certain situations. Like the example with my friend earlier about the teacher, she had to kind of censor herself and withhold how she was going to react so that she wasn't going to be put into a stereotypical role. So that's the two ways that people can react to this type of exhaustion, because it is exhausting to constantly have to be aware of how people are going to react to the things that you say and the things that you do. So these lead us to white guilt, and white guilt is a hard thing to talk about, and it's not just white people that experience white guilt. People of color who are white passing or are light-skinned experience white guilt, and this is something that is it's hard to fight because guilt is a natural instinct for humans. And so I use this quote: guilt is the emotion that shapes so much of our goodness and our generosity. It signals us when we have transgressed from codes of behavior that we personally want to sustain. Feeling guilty informs us that we have failed our own ideals. And white guilt is something that we don't do on purpose. It can be something that is just kind of natural, like I said. And white guilt is where you use those excuses where, like, my ancestors were the ones that owned slaves. I wasn't the one that did it. Why am I being held accountable for that? You kind of deter the actual situation to yourself and to your own feelings rather than addressing the situation that is being brought up. So one of the things that's coming up, I think we could talk about kind of affirmative action a little bit, and how, a lot of white people were against it because they felt it brought a benefit to people of color. But yet there's history of, recorded history of the advantages that white people have received because of racism, right? Brown versus Board, not letting them into schools, not allowing Black and white people to mix in the same classroom. Those advantages were given to white people, and people who are white now have benefited from them, even though they didn't actively participate in them. And once they realize that, there's a sense of guilt that kind of takes over them, and they don't know what to do. And so if we focus on feeling guilty rather than focusing on how we can use our privileges to move forward and to change a system, we will always be stuck in that cycle of, especially that cycle of whiteness. We have to use our white guilt not to feel bad about ourselves, but to move forward into a new type of society that will help everybody. So healthy white guilt leads to change, like I said, transformation in a new life. Unhealthy white guilt leads us to paralysis and inaction. So if we're focusing constantly on how we're feeling instead of how we can help others, we will not move forward, and we will not help the people who really need the help that, who deserve it. So, all right, we have another kind of 5 to 10 minute discussion on white guilt. I didn't want to go too much into it because Emily and I kind of want to create another workshop on it, but it is a hard topic to talk about, especially because we're in academia. There's a lot of white people in here, and so sometimes they can feel personally attacked when we talk about white guilt, but it's not like that. It's understanding how we're feeling and how we can move forward into addressing those feelings. So a lot of the times they were just, I want to be treated like a professional. Like when people come up to me and ask me for help and advice, I am more than happy to do it and be willing to work with that, and not having to question whether or not it's about my own identity. And that was kind of what a lot of people say. And I think that's what we all feel like, where we're like, we don't want people to see us for our, identity. We just want people to see us for the things that we can do and help people. And so that's kind of what they mainly all said. And it also comes down to the top acknowledging that there's issues. If we're right now at the school that I work at, they're pretty good about acknowledging those systemic issues with our students. They're very good about equity with our students, diversity, culturally responsive teaching. They're amazing at it with their students. But when it comes to the staff, they're not really there. And so that's kind of something that also happens, is that when you're working for an institution that acknowledges those systems everywhere, and not just for a group that they see as kind of like a money sign, because that's what they see the students sometimes, as a money sign, because that's where they get their funding from. So that's what they mainly really said throughout the research. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. So this last portion of the workshop is kind of just creating a next step. Like, where do you go from here? You guys did the modules, you participated in these activities, and like I said, there's so much more to learn. So it's kind of the cycle as well: unlearning, relearning, being an ally, and then continuously learning. And also acknowledging where you are in a certain privilege. As a woman, I can speak about women issues and I can acknowledge those things. As a Latina woman, I can speak on those issues and those experiences. I am not a Black woman. I cannot speak on experiences that Black women go through. Therefore, when I'm in a group with Black people, I'm not going to really outshine their voice. I'm going to uplift their voice. I'm going to make sure that they have the platform to speak up, because that's what an ally does. And so that's where we have to really acknowledge our privileges and where we can use them to uplift other people. And so for this last activity, we're going to create SMART goals. And these are, I use this at my school, and they're kind of just a guide to make sure that you know where you want to go to the next step. So short-term, long-terms, creating goals to further expand on the knowledge you have already obtained. So in order to create a SMART goal, it has to be specific, simple, sensible, significant, measurable, meaningful, motivating, achievable, agreed or attainable, relevant, reasonable, realistic, resourced, and result-based, and time-bound. And the reason why we go with SMART goals is because if you have a crazy goal of saying, I'm going to reach 5 workshops in the next month, it's not going to be possible, because you don't even know if there's 5 workshops offered in the next month. But, if you say, I'm going to reach 5 workshops by the end of 2021, that's a little bit more attainable. So it has all the guidelines for you guys to really ensure that you have a goal that you can actually reach. And it's also catered to your own personal style. So if you're not really willing to go full on research mode on these topics, you don't have to. You can probably just focus on reading a book, getting more information, involving yourself in more community-based organizations, things like that. So the S, basically, what do you want to accomplish? Why is this goal important? Who is involved? Where is it located? Which resources or limits are involved? So that's kind of what the S stands for. Questions that you kind of want to answer for the S. How much? How many? How will I know when it's accomplished? How can I accomplish this goal? How realistic is the goal based on other constraints, such as financial factors? Does this seem worthwhile? Is this the right time? Does this match our other efforts' needs? Am I the right person to reach this goal? Is it acceptable in the current socioeconomic environment? So I think the R, am I the right person to reach this goal, comes into those privileges that we've learned about and knowing how to uplift voices. And then the last one, which is the T, when. What can I do in 6 months from now? What can I do in 6 weeks from now? And what can I do today? So what timeline do you want to reach your goal? So here's 2 examples that I have. So the first one is like by June 2021, I will have attended 2 workshops, speaker presentations, or classes related to equity, diversity, or cultural humility. The example number 2 is a little bit shorter, a little bit more manageable if you're just kind of taking little steps. By December 2020, I will have read 2 of the recommended readings suggested from the Cultural Humility Training website. And we have a bunch of readings to recommend if you guys want to learn more about different types of, what's the word? Why am I blanking on the word? I spoke for 2 hours and I'm blanking on the word. Racial dynamics, power dynamics, that's the word I was looking for. So those are the goals. And I believe Emily will post the link to the survey or where you enter your SMART goals. And I believe that's the end of this workshop.